of their wellness center. Before I introduce tonight's special guest presenter, I'd like to acknowledge the New Jersey Council for the Humanities for inviting Brookdale Community College, in collaboration with the Monmouth Museum, to host this very special Smithsonian traveling exhibit entitled Voices and Votes. The exhibit explores American democracy from the earliest of days of the Republic to today. It's free and open to the public from Tuesday through Sunday, 10 to 4 p.m. The last day of the exhibit is this Saturday, October 2nd. Although the MOMS exhibit explores the national democracy story, the collaboration between Brookdale, the Monmouth Museum, and our community partners has given us the opportunity to explore Monmouth County's local history. The companion exhibits alone are well worth the visit. So I please invite you all to attend to go see the exhibit. But Professor Seneca created an incredible companion exhibit just celebrating the life of Geraldine Thompson, so I would like you all to come and visit and see that. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Joan Socco, Interim Vice President and Acting Chief Academic Officer, who will introduce Professor Jane Scimeca. Thank you.
Thank you, Deneen, and welcome everyone. And I would special welcome. We have with us this afternoon some members of the Thompson family. So thank you. It really is our honor to have you join us today. So it is really my privilege to welcome our presenter, Jane Scimeca, who holds the rank of Professor of History at the college. She earned a master's degree in history and a graduate certificate in women's studies from Rutgers University. Professor Scimeca teaches a whole variety of courses, including World Civ 1 and 2, History of New Jersey, and Women's History. She has distinguished herself as a master teacher and campus leader through her passion in the classroom and service to Brookdale Community College faculty. She hosts a podcast channel, New Books in Women's History, on the New Books Network. Her publishing credits include articles for the Asbury Park Press, including, I love this one, Pink is the New Red, White, and Blue, the Women's March in Historical Context. She is also a contributing author to the Encyclopedia of New Jersey. Professor Scimeca speaks frequently in the community on a variety of topics in women's history. Some of her recent presentations include Clara Barton, in her own words, for the Bordentown Historical Society, is the ERA history and women and patriotic service to their communities then and now. Currently, she is working on a book on the life and work of Geraldine Thompson. So it is really my privilege to introduce today's speaker, Professor Jane Scimeca.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you today. When Deneen Jackson first invited me to be included in the Voices and Votes exhibit, I was so excited to connect Mrs. Thompson's life and work to the larger vision of the exhibit, which is democracy. Demos, Greek for democracy. Demos means people. Democracy, power of the people. And if I had to distill Mrs. Thompson's philosophy down, it would be Mrs. Thompson worked for people and wanted to help people. For over 50 years, she served the community of Monmouth County, the state of New Jersey, and the country. She was one of the most important leaders of her generation and belongs in the pantheon of great reformers, Jane Addams, Mary Church Terrell, and Dorothea Dix. Among her many accomplishments, she was the first woman appointed to a state board, the Department of Institutions and Agencies. On that board for over 40 years, she visited and managed state prisons, reformatories, and hospitals. She wanted to ensure that the ill, the poor, and the incarcerated were treated with dignity. She founded in 1912 the Monmouth County Organization for Social Services, which still to this day serves over 60,000 families in Monmouth County a year. So over 110 years later, her impact is still with us. She was the first woman in New Jersey to serve as a delegate to the Republican National Committee, and she went to every Republican National Convention from 1924 until 1952. She funded the study to reform the New Jersey Poor Laws, which, as you know, the poor laws in New Jersey meant that if you couldn't pay your bills, you were incarcerated, with people who had committed crimes, with orphans, with women, with men. Everybody was incarcerated together. So by funding the reform of the poor laws, she was beginning a legislative shift that had been with New Jersey from the English common law times. She was the vice president of the New Jersey State Federation of Women's Clubs. She fought for women's suffrage. She served and was a fundraiser for the Red Cross. She gave money for scholarships, and she was a temperance leader as well. We also know that towards the end of her life, she donated her land to become Thompson Park. And so her life's work includes a great many things and an enormous variety of different interests. I'm writing and researching the first comprehensive biography of Geraldine Thompson. And to underscore her belief in democracy and her contributions to the country, I wanted to include a couple of early quotes here. She wrote the annual reports for the Monmouth County Organization of Social Services every year. And in one of the annual reports, she wrote, "The best citizen is one who can see himself as an equally responsible member of the smallest to the largest unit, and who realizes how dependent the welfare of each individual is on proper functioning of national, state, county, and local government." So she understood this connection between working for the individual, working for the dignity of the individual, and its impact on the country as a whole. This is a picture of her giving a check. This looks like probably around 1960 or so, giving a check to the Boy Scouts. She was the founder of the Boy Scouts in Monmouth County in 1917 and remained committed to the Boy Scouts. So this idea from the smallest to the largest, that she was on the state board of departments of institutions and agencies. She was reappointed by 8 different governors of both parties, and she's giving checks to the Boy Scouts and encouraging and allowing the Boy Scouts to camp on her land as well. So her commitment to working for others through institutions, education, and public health were all a part of her enormous contribution. She believed when you serve your neighbors, you're serving the country as a whole. The working title of the book that I'm writing is called Mrs. Thompson Saves the Day. And I've been working on this project for over a year, and it's still the title that I'm most happy with so far. Why is this book necessary? She's being forgotten. I feel that many people who live in the county, who drive by the park every day, who attend Brookdale Community College, don't understand the connection to her. And I want to serve her story. I want to honor all that she has given to this country. I also think it's important to write this book to inspire us, to serve our communities. Her story should be an inspiration to us, for us to want to help others as well. She had enormous compassion for the less fortunate, and if we can, even in a small way, emulate her great work, we will be strengthening our democracy in the process. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about my research process. I just want to talk very briefly about what I'm going through and doing this sort of in the middle. And then I'm going to talk about what I found. And I found some really cool things. So I'm going to let you in on some of my discoveries and some of my treasures. The research process when you do women's history is very different. People have not saved women's stuff. So when most people pass away, they're, if they're a public person, their papers, their effects, the things that they created are kept and put in a library, donated to a library. In women's history, this is rare. Most women's stuff is not preserved. Even really well-known women in New Jersey history don't have any papers. And so how do you write a book without their papers? How do you write a book without the primary sources? It's very hard. So this has been a really difficult process. I essentially have had to connect her to everyone that I think she knows, everyone I think that she worked with, everybody that she was related to, and look in their papers. So she's scattered all throughout the country. I have been in archives from Montana to West Virginia to Connecticut. She is all over the place. And I have there's now a pattern. Whenever I talk to a librarian or an archivist, I call and I say, oh, you have the XYZ papers. I'm looking for materials from Geraldine Thompson. And they say, well, do you use the finding aid, which is sort of like the little search bar? And I said, yes, and she didn't come up. But she's in there because I know she wrote that person letters and you have to find them. And they say, okay, well, you have to come up here and look through the boxes. We can't do that for you, so you have to come and figure it out. And I found her. But it really has been a very painstaking process. And so the rewards, though, have been very rich. And so I'm going to share some of what I've learned from this process. Also, history versus biography. Is writing history different than writing biography? And it's really an interesting question. I certainly did not embark on this project with this in mind. I am a historian, and I teach history and didn't think anything of it. But it is. And when you write biography, you're really focused on the personality driving the story, not so much the history driving the story. And so it's really put an enormous amount of pressure on me to not fall into my comfort zone of writing history, but writing biography. So it's been a really interesting training. It's been a really interesting challenge for me. I have on the slide the artist under oath. So when you are writing a biography, you have to create the person. Now, I said that Mrs. Thompson doesn't have a biography. There was no other biography for me to read and to use. There are sections of A Triangle of Land. There are numerous newspaper articles on her, but there's no book. So I'm creating her out of the secondary sources and the letters that I can find. And so it's really been a really fascinating creative process, that to write her story while being faithful to the documents, right? The artist under oath. And some of the sources have been really wonderful. I'm going to start with her daughter. Her daughter is Elizabeth Thompson Babcock, Betty Babcock. She was born in 1900 and grew up here on the farm. She is one of the 4 Thompson children. And Betty Babcock was the only surviving child after Mrs. Thompson passed away in 1967. The 3 other children predeceased Mrs. Thompson. And when the farm went to the Monmouth County Park system, Mrs. Babcock wrote a number of letters of the family history and sent them to the Monmouth County Park system. She also wrote a letter to Lee Cook from the Asbury Park Press. So she was the only remaining child, and she leaves several letters that are narrative of the family history. This was an enormous help to me to use these letters. And she writes about Brookdale, the Brookdale farm, saying that when she was a child, Brookdale was a paradise. Growing up here was a paradise. And it's really interesting because even other people that I've interviewed and talked to who rented an apartment from Mrs. Thompson in the 50s, people who were here for different periods of their lives, they all talk about how wonderful it was to live on this farm. And so it seems to be that Mrs. Babcock's reminiscence of the farm is shared by many other people. Mrs. Babcock was also an artist, and she was an author. She wrote a children's book that was published and was very well received. So we have Betty's recollection. And so this is the way that she signed a letter, one of her long family histories that she wrote in 1974 and mailed to Lee Cook at the Asbury Park Press. She finishes the letter, "I trust these long-winded notes will be of some use. Yours sincerely, Betty Babcock." Yes, Betty, they have been a lot of use. Thank you very much. There's some problems. There's things she leaves out. She's protecting her family. I understand. We have to understand as historians that Betty has a point of view. She loved her mother, and she loved living here at Brookdale Farm, but she wanted to protect her mother too. And so this comes up a lot in my research process. The things that she doesn't write about are just as significant as the things she does write about. One of the things she doesn't write about is Miriam Van Waters. Miriam Van Waters, I'm going to talk about a little later in the presentation, was Mrs. Thompson's close friend and has been described by a lot of historians before me as her romantic partner. Miriam Van Waters left papers, and these papers were not thrown away, but were preserved. She was quite a well-known woman of her time, and she was a famous expert in juvenile delinquency, juvenile corrections, and was the superintendent of the Women's Reformatory in Massachusetts. She kept diaries from, her entire life. And so whenever I'm researching anything and find anything about Mrs. Thompson, I look in Miriam's diary to see if Miriam writes about it at the same time. Does she remark on what is going on in the Thompson household? And you see in the slide, I actually have highlighted a part of the diary there where she talks about Thursday to Tuesday, April 20th, 1948, that she is at Brookdale. Walk in woods, burn brush. Bill improved. She's talking about Bill Thompson improved. He'd been very sick. Talks with Martha Harding regarding Hollywood, and Catherine Rayburn, which I think she means Hepburn. Alice Babcock comes and brings a van of horses from Maryland. So she does include in her entries of her diary a tremendous amount of what's going on in the Thompson house. Who's sick, who died. She shares a tremendous amount of personal recollection. So it's a really fascinating and enormously helpful resource. Harvard is wonderful. These diaries and letters between her and Mrs. Thompson are both scanned as PDFs up on the Radcliffe website from Schlesinger Library. And so during the shutdown, when I was working on this, I couldn't do primary research. I was just reading these scans until my eyeballs fell out and reading Geraldine Thompson's letters and Miriam Van Waters' diary and trying to put the picture together. So I have Betty's recollection and I have Miriam's letters and Miriam's diary. So let me talk a little bit about Mrs. Thompson. Geraldine Livingston Morgan, she was born, she marries Lou Thompson and becomes a Thompson. She was born in 1872 and she died in 1967, so she lived 95 years. She was born into a very wealthy and prominent New York family, so she's not a New Jersey person, she's a New York person. And she's a member of the Livingston family. The Livingston family that is, she's a descendant of the signers of the Declaration of Independence and the men who fought in the American Revolutionary War. And so she is a descendant of an extremely prominent Livingston family. She's also a descendant of the Hamiltons, as in Alexander Hamilton. So she has a tremendous amount of prominent roots. She grew up mostly in New York City on 26 Washington Square, in the north side of Washington Square, and spent the summers in Dutchess County on the Hudson River Valley in her family's seat in Statsburg. That was the county seat for her family. And the Livingstons have a number of different houses. They all have houses along the Hudson River Valley. One writer described the Livingston family homes as like pearls strung on a string, one all the way up the Hudson River. She was a neighbor of the Roosevelts and the Vanderbilts in Hyde Park. So she had, that was the world she grew up in. In terms of her education, I'm going to talk about her education next. She did not attend school. Women of her social class were normally tutored at home by private tutors, and she did attend 2 years in France at a convent school in France. Another important part of her life is the influence of her grandmother and her sisters and her mother, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So here's a slide that shows her two homes. One on the left is the home in Washington Square, which is still there. It's now known as the William Dare Morgan House, which was her father's name. This is where she lived in New York. And then the Statsburg House is on the right, which is known as The Point, which is where her family, and I actually have a picture of her family sitting in that archway in the middle of between the two porches on the first floor. So here they are sitting, I believe, in that archway. So this is a picture of her family. I don't have identifications for everybody, but Geraldine is sitting center with the dog. And she's a little girl sitting with the dog in the middle. Her mother is the woman on the left in the white dress, all the way on the left. Her father is in shadow, 2 people over from the mother. You can barely make out his face. And so I think this picture is probably from about 1885. She's probably about 12 or 13 years old in this picture. Her 2 sisters are all the way on the right. Her sister Ruth is the shorter one, and the taller woman in white is her sister Margaret. The other people in the family, I don't know everybody else in this picture. I believe the Carnochans are in this picture, but I don't know, haven't been able to identify the other people. But we get sort of, this is the oldest picture I have of her. So let me talk a little bit about her grandmother. Her grandmother was Geraldine Livingston Hoyt, and was the probably one of the biggest early influences on the 3 daughters, Margaret, Ruth, and Geraldine. She also lived on Washington Square, and every week her grandmother would get into a carriage and be driven over to the river, where she would get in a boat and go across the river to oops, I'm just going to confirm this. Okay, thanks. Thank you. To Blackwell's Island. Blackwell's Island was the institution in New York City that had different hospitals and a penitentiary there. And why would she be going every week to Blackwell's Island? Well, she was going as a member of the State Charity Aid Association of New York City, and her grandmother would go every week and would take inspection. She would inspect the conditions. She would inspect how everybody was being treated, and then she would bring that report back to the State Charity Aid Association and would try to protect these people by putting pressure on political leaders. And she would come home from these, and she would have her lunch, and she'd sit down with these three girls and tell them all about what she saw. So, that kind of the expression, you can't be it unless you see it, you can be it, that kind of thing. Well, I think that her grandmother, Geraldine Hoyt, another Geraldine, was a very, very important influence on her. I was able to find something else about her, because as I said, very few sources remain for women in history. When she passed away in April of 1897, there was a religious service for her, and they printed a memorial book that had the sermon that was given by the minister that day, and also they included an article praising Mrs. Hoyt. And this is a little excerpt from the memorial book, which I am grateful to the Statsburg State Historical Site through the New York Park System provided me with this. Quote, few people who know anything about the family from which Mrs. Hoyt came have failed to notice how capacity for administration seems to run in it. They like to run things. We're not chicken, right? It is certain that the trait was very noticeable, and in none of them more than in Mrs. Hoyt, whose practical sense and shrewdness were constantly displayed in the works of charity to which she devoted herself. Kind and forgiving as she was, she made herself everywhere felt. After her death, someone at Bellevue Hospital asked what special ward she had been interested in. The answer given illustrated the effect of her influence. It was neither one ward nor another. The whole hospital was Mrs. Hoyt's. She never hurt people's feelings. She was never rude, never arrogant, and was totally devoid of pride of position. Yet she was never compliant, never failed to express her opinion unmistakably, and remained the superior of her equals without ever asserting any superiority. She was always looked up to, though she never seemed herself to look down. So here is somebody who's being described very similar to how we would describe Mrs. Thompson. Somebody who is kind and is interested in helping others and knows how to run things, right? And that certainly is part of Mrs. Thompson's profile as well. She was also part of the founding of the nursing program at Bellevue Hospital. We probably, kind of take nursing for granted, but nursing was a new profession after the Civil War. Nursing did not exist as a trained profession. And so Mrs. Thompson, Mrs. Hoyt, and the other women in the State Charity Aid Society were concerned that people at the hospital have trained nurses to take care of them. And so they went and visited Florence Nightingale in England, and they got their course of study, and they brought it back to New York, and they said, this is how we're going to run our nursing program. So she was really at the ground floor of creating the nursing program, the first one in the United States. I think she's a pretty good model, when we're looking back. She's very similar to Mrs. Thompson. So I got to think, if we're interested in what shaped Mrs. Thompson, if we want to understand what made Mrs. Thompson who she is, these are the influences. Her grandmother is a very important influence. Another really important influence, I think, is her education. I mentioned before that she did not go to school, that she was tutored at home. But after her father passed away, the family moved to France for a couple of years. And this is I'm still a little unsure of all the timelines. There are ship manifests that show the mother, her brother, her three sisters all going to Europe and coming back. But there's not a whole lot of detail I know at this point. I do know that she went to the Sacred Heart School in France. And so I looked a little bit into the Sacred Heart School. What was the Sacred Heart School? What was their mission? And what I learned was that the Sacred Heart School was founded by a French nun named Madeleine Sophie Barat. And she founded this Society of the Sacred Heart as a result of the French Revolution. So the French Revolution was very violent, enormous upheaval in French society, and she was really distressed at the violence and the loss of order in France after the French Revolution in the early 19th century. She decides that she's going to begin the Sacred Heart as a solution to France's disorder. Her idea was to educate women, which was not a popular idea at the time. She believed that if you educate women, you can restore France's moral order. And so she began these schools of the Sacred Heart with nuns as the teachers who were very strictly trained and had to pass exams in order to be able to be in the classroom. And she believed that they had a duty to repair society's flaws, and that it was educated women who were going to be the chief means of social change. That the mission of the school was to cultivate virtuous, moral women who were also well-educated, helpful, and intelligent. And this idea of helping and being a servant to your community, I think, comes from this education that she received at the School of the Sacred Heart. She goes for 2 years, and her sisters do too. And then I found this. So this is a little bit out of our time frame, but I wanted to introduce something else that I thought was a really important influence on Mrs. Thompson. I found an article in the New York Times from December of 1926. And in this article, it describes Mrs. Roosevelt, who was not obviously the First Lady yet. She was still just Eleanor Roosevelt. Mrs. Roosevelt was arrested for picketing with paper box makers on Green Street and West Houston Street. And she was picketing alongside 7 other society women. The other women are Mrs. Gordon Norrie, that's Margaret, that's her sister Margaret. She's with Margaret, and she's also with the last person in that highlighted section, Miss Evelyn Preston. Miss Evelyn Preston was Geraldine Thompson's niece. So when I found this, I said, they get arrested. They go picket in solidarity with these paper box makers in Greenwich Village, and they get, the police tell them to go home, and they say no, and they get dragged into the paddy wagon, and they get arrested together. And so the article says that the arrests were made while the police were dispersing a small crowd of strikers who were lingering in Green Street and obstructing the sidewalk. So I'm thinking, wow, these other women in the family are also really important. So I began looking into her niece and her sister. This is a picture of her sister that I actually only just got, this picture of Margaret Norrie. So Margaret Morgan Norrie. This is Geraldine Thompson's older sister. This woman was just incredible. And I think she had an enormous influence in Geraldine Thompson's life. And when she died, I think that her death, Mrs. Thompson took harder than any other tragedy in her life. And she had plenty. So Margaret Norrie distinguished herself as a suffragist. She was the leader of the New York Women's Suffrage Association. She was a founder of the Colony Club, and the Colony Club is sort of the female equivalent to like the Knickerbocker Club and these other men's clubs in New York, where wealthy women would get together and they would have speakers and they would have lunch and play cards and things like that. She was a progressive reformer. She was extremely dedicated to temperance. And this is another issue that Mrs. Thompson is also a real advocate for. Temperance was to outlaw alcohol. And so she was a member of the Temperance Society, but she was also after the 18th Amendment was passed, she worked really hard to force the government to enforce it, because you could have prohibition, but if nobody's arresting anybody and everybody's just sort of the wink saying, yeah, you can take that wine, So she was a really an advocate for enforcement of the 18th Amendment. And she wrote a really well-circulated article called "I Serve No Cocktails." And I found this article this interview she gave. It's really an essay in the form of an article that is easy to find online. You can read it, and it's terrific. She really describes drinking in the high society homes and how people drink, 3 different kinds of wine at dinner, and then they have a drink, and then they have an after dinner drink, and then they have another drink, and then they have it. And so she talks about how destructive it is. And she's really a incredibly courageous, passionate woman. And so she was also a very well-known reformer in New York City. And she's only like 3 years older than Geraldine Thompson, but she is just an incredible person. And then I found this. I was just so blown away by this. Yeah. So Frances Perkins, you guys know Frances Perkins was the first Secretary of Labor who was a woman, right? The first cabinet secretary who was a woman. And she was appointed by FDR to serve in the Roosevelt administration. And she's responsible for writing the Social Security Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act, the minimum wage, eliminating child labor. She is probably the most significant Secretary of Labor in American history. What turned Frances Perkins into a lobbyist was her experience at the Triangle Factory fire in 1911. And Elizabeth Warren talks about this. If you ever listen to Elizabeth Warren speak, she still talks about this. Elizabeth Warren talks about this event. I was reading a biography of Frances Perkins. And in the biography of Frances Perkins, I'm reading the chapter on the Triangle Fire, which takes place in March 25th of 1911. And the beginning of the chapter talks about Frances Perkins being in Washington Square, which I knew she was there, but I didn't know why. She was visiting Margaret Maury that afternoon, when the Triangle Fire broke out. So I went and I looked at the oral history files for Columbia University. Columbia University has these oral histories, and they have an oral history of Frances Perkins. And this is what Frances Perkins says about Mrs. Maury. I was in Washington Square at the time of the fire by pure chance. I was having tea with Mrs. Gordon Maury, who lived on the north side of the square. She was Margaret Morgan by birth. She was the sister of Ruth Morgan. She was a well-known person and a friend of mine. So I'm like, okay. So not only is Margaret an incredible, courageous reformer, but she is really also really inspired by the same things that people like Eleanor Roosevelt and Frances Perkins are. Right? She's with them in all these crusades and all these different efforts. The connection to Frances Perkins just blew me away. And I realized that the connection, the intersection of all these incredible women is just going to enrich Mrs. Thompson's story. Unfortunately, about 10 months later, Margaret Maury died. She died in August of 1927, and I had to, because I couldn't my curiosity was too strong. I actually ordered her death certificate from Vital Records to see. I was like, what happened? I have to know what happened to her. And so her death hits Geraldine Thompson like a ton of bricks. She's just absolutely devastated. And everyone is devastated. The articles in the paper that were her, the tributes to her from the other women she worked with in these organizations make you cry. That's how absolutely beautiful they are. And so I took one excerpt from one of them. She was on the board, Margaret was on the board of a magazine called The Nation. And so The Nation did a special tribute to her, and it's published in a booklet that I got from Smith Library. So these libraries, man, they're saving me. And so this was part of the beautiful tribute that was written and published in The Nation. Margaret Norrie took the unpopular side, facing the scorn and sneers of friends, but facing also the facts, realizing the extent of the opposition. She was the kind to make any renunciation for herself at any price if it meant to benefit the common weal. To be unpopular because of her championing unpopular causes, that meant nothing to her. So she is just an incredibly courageous person and fought for suffrage and fought for temperance and fought for the paper box makers, and she's this person. And then I remembered something that I had read in Triangle of Land. So in Triangle of Land, there's a quote from actually a manuscript of a biography of Mrs. Thompson that was never published, and I don't know where it is. But somebody started a biography of Mrs. Thompson that was never published. And they asked her, the historian interviewing her, asked her, what was, all these years you reached this old age, what is your secret? And she said, keep working for at least one cause, preferably an unpopular one. She said that in 1965. Margaret died in 1927. And I couldn't help but be just blown away by that connection. I feel that she really devoted her work in large part to serve her sister's memory. And after her sister died in 1927, so she died in August of 1927. At that time, Mrs. Thompson was a member of the Republican National Committee. She had a very important position in the Republican Party. October 12th, she sends a letter of resignation to the head of the Republican National Committee. And the letter is heartbreaking in a lot of ways. She talks about the political issues. And then at the end of the letter, she gets personal. And she writes this. What I find now is that the death of Mrs. Norrie had laid an obligation upon me to give more time to the understanding of political truths and political philosophy. It has perhaps something of a memorial, as I am undertaking what I know will prove a hard task for me, as a tribute of deep admiration and affection to one who always chose the difficult path of a pioneer. Her sister is an influence, right? Something that I had absolutely no idea about before until I started connecting the dots between the paper box makers and the trying of fire, and all these things started to make sense to me. Her other sister, Ruth Morgan. Ruth never married. She has sometimes been claimed also as a gay woman. She is being embraced as a gay woman now. But she is equally as important to Geraldine Thompson's life. She was a founder of the Colony Club, and she was vice president of the League of Women Voters. She worked with Carrie Catt and was very important in the suffrage cause. During World War I, she was one of 5 high commissioners and went to Europe during World War I and ran the entire nursing organization for the Red Cross. When she came back, she became a peace activist because World War I changes people's perception of nationalism and war. And Ruth Morgan and Margaret Maury, both of them, became very devoted to outlawing war and supporting peace. And Ruth Morgan was the head of the International Alliance of Women's Committee for Peace, and she also was an officer for the National Committee on Cause and Cure for War, which you may have heard of. She advised Hoover on peace. She advised Roosevelt on peace. She was a very big deal. No papers. Save your papers. I can't tell you, this woman deserves a book, and there's no papers. It's heartbreaking. Now, she does have a lot of letters in the Eleanor Roosevelt collection, which I have now, but just an absolutely incredible individual who also was an enormous, enormous influence on Mrs. Thompson. So, influences: her grandmother, her education, and her 2 sisters. The other big influence is her own personal tragedy of tuberculosis. She contracted tuberculosis, I don't know when. She says when she was a young woman. Betty Babcock does tell a story about how she would go out and ride her bike and then, hemorrhage, So, that's, how tuberculosis makes itself evident. So she had tuberculosis as a young woman. She very rarely spoke about it. In fact, only in one interview, she talks about that as a young, the interviewer, the newspaper man, asks her, why did you give so much money to tuberculosis? And she says, well, as a young woman, I had to travel around because I had tuberculosis. So where is she traveling to? She travels to Colorado. Dry air, and the altitude was thought to be helpful. There was no cure for tuberculosis because, even today, tuberculosis is still a problem. But in the 19th century, it was really the biggest killer of people in the 19th century. And actually, a lot of people in this family die of tuberculosis. The Thompsons have terrible tuberculosis in their family and that side of the family. And her one nephew, Evelyn Preston's brother, he dies of tuberculosis. So tuberculosis is everywhere. Rich and poor. The only treatment that they recommended for it was this sanitary protocol. Sit outside in the cold, dry air. Eat really heavy diet so you don't waste away. And rest. Complete rest. And you see people resting outside on these lounge chairs, these nice wicker lounge chairs, to take the sun, to take the air, and to rest. And tuberculosis is really tricky because even if you recover from tuberculosis, it never dies. It stays alive. Your white blood cells kind of encase it, but it can be reactivated. Like when you see the commercials for those steroidal drugs on TV, and they say, don't take this if you've ever had tuberculosis, because steroids will reactivate tuberculosis. In fact, that's what killed Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt had also had tuberculosis. She recovered, but then in 1962, she took a steroidal treatment, reactivated her tuberculosis, and killed her. So tuberculosis it's a very tricky condition, and we know, we've been through our own plague recently, so we understand how these pulmonary type things are terrible to manage. I think Colorado is another really important part of my story. So I know she was in Colorado. I found her in a newspaper. In 1895, there was an article that talks about her attending a dance at the El Paso Club We had this big dance, this big party, and Miss Morgan of New York was there. I'm like, there you are. I found you. So she was in Colorado for health reasons, but apparently she had a little fun while she was there as well. And she meets Ruby. So she meets her husband in Colorado as well. So that's another important reason for Colorado playing a big role in her life. And Lou and Geraldine Thompson returned to Colorado all the time. They turn up back in Colorado almost every single year. They maintain this connection to Colorado. And I just recently learned that actually Betty was born in Colorado and that she was baptized in Colorado. Lou shows up in the papers there every year because he goes out west for a hunting trip. And it's always in the paper. L.S. Thompson is in town for his annual hunting trip. So it is a very important part of their marriage and also for their health. In addition, I find that Colorado, I wonder, also had a political influence on her. And the reason I'm thinking this is because she was in Colorado when Colorado enfranchised women. Women are enfranchised in Colorado in 1893, 27 years before the rest of the country. And the Republican women's campaign in Colorado was extremely active. They were fantastic campaigners, and the men candidates in Colorado are like, yeah, these women are fantastic. They're like getting all these votes, and they're working the campaign. So I can imagine her sitting in one of those chairs, sitting outside, and reading the paper and reading about all this stuff. And so I wonder, and this is something I've been exploring, is does the political activism of the women in Colorado inspire her? Does she get kind of excited by the politics of the Republican women's groups? Does she get well as well? And she meets her husband, Lewis S. Thompson. This is a story that is told in different ways through Betty's letters and different ways through interviews with Mrs. Thompson. Mrs. Thompson is asked how she met her husband. She says, we met in a health resort in Colorado. Her husband, Lewis Thompson, was born in 1865. So he's 7 years older than she is, but is in very, very bad health. He had typhoid and tuberculosis. He had one lung left from suffering from tuberculosis. And he was very, very sick. He goes to Colorado to get better also. I have not been able to find records in Colorado because patient records are really hard to get because of HIPAA, even though it's like 130 years ago, you can't, because of HIPAA, you can't get people's patient records. Even when I look when I'm in the state archives and I'm looking at some of these prison records, the prison reformatories that I'm looking at, I have to sign something to say I won't use a prisoner's name. It's 120 years ago, but still, you have to sign that you're not going to use anybody's name. So be that as it may, I don't know which hospital, sanatorium, or health resort they were in yet. I'm a dog with a bone trying to find out. So she meets Lou Thompson there. She says she met him at a health resort. Betty Babcock tells a slightly different story. In Betty's letter, she says that Geraldine was introduced to Lou through his sister. His sister was living in Colorado Springs also, and she met Geraldine and apparently wrote a telegram to her brother saying, have just met the girl you should marry, come at once. Which makes it a better story. It's a bit more romantic, but I'm not sure if it's actually accurate or not. Betty tells a very good story, I have to say. Be that as it may, she does meet Lou Thompson, and this is at a time when the Thompson family is going through a tremendous amount of turmoil. But before I get to the turmoil, I'm just going to talk a little bit about their engagement. Lou wrote a letter, and I've just recently found this letter. He wrote a letter to his uncle. Lou's uncle was J.N. Camden, Johnson Newland Camden, who was a United States Senator from West Virginia. Don't worry, I never heard of him either. And because he was a United States Senator, they saved his papers. And he was Lou's uncle, and he was Lou's father's brother-in-law. But they were in business together, and they were very, very close. So Camden is married to Lou's aunt, Annie. These papers are in the University of West Virginia, not categorized. So everything from 1892 in a box. Everything from 1893 in a box. If you want to find a letter, you have to go through the whole box. So I know the years I want, so I can narrow it down a little bit. But this is the letter that just came to me. So this is a letter from Lewis Thompson to his uncle, May 10th, 1896. My dear uncle, as you keep posted on the important events of the day, I don't suppose you will be surprised to hear the news of my engagement to Miss Morgan of New York. When I read that, I almost fainted. Some unofficial rumors have been flying about, but this one is official from headquarters, and I am glad to say meets with generous and hearty approval. June 20th has been set for the day of the wedding, which will of course be a very simple and quiet affair. I am counting on you and Aunt Annie. Where is it? To be on hand and to give your blessing and good wishes for our future happiness. With love from us all to you and yours, affectionately, your nephew, Lewis S. Thompson. You know, just having that corroboration, that verification of the event was so important to me. I knew that they had gotten engaged. I didn't know what happened. But now at least, and I have to say, Lou sounds so happy in that note. You know, he sounds so happy. It's official from headquarters. I'm getting married. Get over and visit me, right? She goes, get out here and come to the wedding, right? So he's so happy. They do get married, but not on June 20th. They get married on June 16th. I don't know what happened. But they get married on June 16th. They get married at St. Margaret's Church in Statsburg, New York, which is this tiny, little, adorable church that was built by Geraldine's great-grandfather and great-grandmother, named after her great-grandmother, Margaret, in kind of honor of her. And I went and saw the little church when I went up to the Eleanor Roosevelt papers. It is just the most adorable little church. And so when they got married, they had a special train from New York, bring all the high society family members and all the high society guests to Statsburg for the wedding. And then they have a beautiful lunch at grandmother's house at the Point, which I showed you that picture of the Point earlier. They have the wedding lunch at the Point. And shortly after that, they moved to Brookdale Farm. So I've got to get you to Brookdale Farm. So let me talk a little bit about Brookdale Farm and to the Thompsons and the turmoil in the Thompson family. So, how do the Thompsons acquire Brookdale Farm? They acquire Brookdale Farm after the death of David Dunham Withers. David Dunham Withers was a wealthy businessman who had become a big fan of horse racing. He made his money in the southern states. He was actually a New Yorker who moved to Mississippi and Louisiana. He had cotton and sugar plantations, and you know what that means, enslaved labor. And during the Civil War, he doesn't want to get involved or choose sides in the war. So he goes to France and decides, I'm just rich, I'm just going to hang out with France for the next, until this war is over. And while he's there, he becomes a big fan of horse racing. And while he is becoming a big fan of horse racing, he becomes studying it. And he was a very kind of an intellectual fan of horse racing. He builds this big horse library of books and studies it. when the war is over and he returns to the United States, he begins to buy land adjacent to each other, 5 different parcels of land, and he makes Brookdale Farm by combining all these different parcels together. The farm, he picks this land in Monmouth County because it was extremely good for farming and for horses. That the soil was enhanced with marl, which is a potash of a kind of green clay, which was very good for growing crops and very good for the horses' feet. And it had 3 streams, so it was very well ordered. So he buys this plot of land and he begins to design and to oversee the construction of all the rings and the barns and the stables and everything. And some of these buildings are still there. But then, how's he going to raise horses there, right? Remember, during the Civil War, most of the good bloodlines died on the Civil War battlefields. So he begins to import horses from Europe. He imports horses from Europe and begins to breed horses. And really kind of revives American horse racing by restoring the bloodlines of these great American racehorses. And he becomes famous. He becomes known as the Sage of Brookdale for these incredible racehorses he's raising and winning these prizes all over the place. Monmouth Park became up for sale, and he gets a group of men together, his friends, and they buy Monmouth Park, and he wants to make Monmouth Park the Ascot of America. He wants to emulate English racing. And so he was a very scrupulous person. He never bet. So somebody in horse racing who doesn't bet on horses. So he was very suspect by all the other horse racing men. They were like, what's wrong with him? He doesn't bet. So he never placed a bet, but he loved to win, and he loved the intellectual challenge of building and racing these horses. So he spends 20 years doing this at Brookdale, from about 1872 until his death in 1892. When he died, he had never married and he had no children. So his estate was left to his brothers and sisters, and they sold it. It went on the market, and Lewis Thompson's father, William Payne Thompson, bought it. It's likely that they knew each other. He probably knew Withers. Withers knew Geraldine's father, too. They were both members of the Knickerbocker Club. And when Geraldine's father died, in the funeral article on the funeral of Geraldine Thompson's father, William Dare Morgan, David Dunham Withers is listed as one of his pallbearers. So she had this connection to Brookdale before she even knew she had a connection to Brookdale. William Payne Thompson and his wife, Mary Evelyn Moffett Thompson, bought Brookdale Farm. And the way that the Thompsons become interested in Brookdale Farm is that Colonel Thompson had, after the Civil War, he fought the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy. He was a colonel in the 9th Virginia Cavalry. He fought at Appomattox, he fought at Bull Run. And after the war, he went into newspaper business for a while, and then he went to the oil business. And Camden, who I told you I got all these papers from, who was the U.S. Senator for West Virginia, was his business partner. So he and Camden start this oil business in West Virginia, and ultimately it becomes bought by John D. Rockefeller at Standard Oil. When his oil company is combined into Standard Oil, he becomes one of the directors of Standard Oil and works down the hall from John D. Rockefeller. And he makes a fortune. He makes a fortune at Standard Oil, and after he works at Standard Oil, he becomes a director of a bank, and he becomes an owner of the Ohio Railroad, and then he begins a new company called the National Lead Trust, which was a group of lead companies companies that were really trying to produce lead for paint to build. I guess paint was mixed. You used to have to mix your own paint for commercially manufactured paint. So he bought Brookdale Farm in 1893 for about $135,000 plus the horses. And he wrote this letter in 1893, also from the same collection from West Virginia. Dear Camden, I have concluded the purchase of the Withers Farm. It takes about $250,000, and later on, I suppose, more to round it up. But the more I think about it, the better I am satisfied that it was a wise and proper thing for me to do at this time. Both of my boys have got some bad physical taints. Willie, especially. Louis, I think, will grow out. I am uncertain about Willie, but apparently the best thing I can do now is to learn new business and keep them in the open air. It furnishes a good relaxation for myself and puts me, as I think, in a more dignified position. And then the next month, he writes him again. And in his next letter, he wrote, Dear Camden, this is April of 1893. Dear Camden, and I know you can't read that, but it's just a copy of the National Lead Company letterhead with William T. Thompson signed at the bottom. I go down to the farm every Friday now, and it is a source of great delight. For the first time in my life, I've got something that I really wanted, and that I enjoy. I am very anxious for you to see the place, to go over with you the general line of thought I have had in securing it, and that I now have in running it. So I just love it. I finally got something I always wanted, right? He really is just kind of effusive in his love for this farm. And so he and his wife live at the farm. Every Friday they go to the farm from New York, and they enjoy the farm. And they do a massive renovation on the Withers house that was in the papers as well, that describes this enormous renovation that they did. However, in January of 1896, Colonel Thompson falls ill very quickly with pneumonia, and within a couple of days he dies. So he died in February of 1896, and in none of his letters does he mention Geraldine Morgan. There are lots of mentions of Betty's wedding and Betty's fiance, and Betty's wedding is going to be like, and what her fiance Ralph Preston is like, lots and lots and lots of that. Not one mention of Geraldine Morgan and Lou. And so Lou writes that note in May. So I was kind of hoping that I would get her father-in-law's impression of her, but it was not to come to pass. So I am going to assume that he didn't know that at some point, for some reason, Lou never introduced them, or it just did not work out. I don't know the answer to that mystery, but I got a lot out of those Camden papers. So they move to Brookdale Farm. This is the crane shot courtesy of the Monmouth County Park System. And so this is where they come and they live. And this is where they raise 4 children. They have 4 children. And they also raise 5 other children that were nieces and nephews from Lou's sister Betty and her husband. Betty died after having her 4th child in maternal complications, and her husband, Ralph Preston, leaves them at Brookdale Farm, and they are raised with the Thompson children. Betty Babcock wrote, I just thought I had 2 brothers named Bill and 2 brothers named Louis. So they just were always together. It was a big crowd of children. And they also adopted Annie Thompson, who was orphaned because, as I said, and if you read the Thompson letters in the Camden papers, a lot of these letters are about all the sickness and the death and the problems that the Thompson family has and all these orphan kids. And they're talking about who's going to take care of this kid and who's going to take this kid. And mom can't do it, she's too old. And, they're dealing with all those kinds of family issues that we all deal with, right? But Lou takes the call, and Geraldine and Louis raise all these kids on Thompson Farm. Thompson Farm, Brookdale Farm becomes her headquarters. In addition to the place where she raises her family, this becomes the centerpiece of her operations. For social reform, for political activities, fundraising, it all happens at Brookdale Farm. She always has an open door, inviting the public, having everything from the pet show to having Eleanor Roosevelt there and entertaining governor and the senators and political dignitaries. So it really becomes a character in the book because of what it serves her and her work. And here's a picture of her having a meeting in the house, and you can see her, with her notes talking to her staff. And so I imagine her thinking of Brookdale Farm as it sort of was like a little village unto itself. Everybody lived on the farm, not just the Thompson family, but the staff all lived on the farm. You have the whole horse operations going on, all those people. There's farming going on. That it was sort of almost like a self-contained little village under itself. But Lou's not there very much. And this becomes another really interesting part of her life and a little mystery as well. Lou spends much of the year at Sunny Hill Plantation in Georgia. He bought another farm in Georgia named Sunny Hill, which was in Thomasville, Georgia, on the Florida-Georgia line. And it was really known for quail hunting and had become a destination for a lot of very wealthy men to go and hunt, and a lot of very, very big names in politics and business all loved to go to Thomasville, Georgia for hunting. And that's Lou on the left, talking to Walter Teagle, one of his friends, and they raised hunting dogs and they had different competitions and things. So he bought Sunny Hill Plantation in 1905. It was like about 12,000 acres. Again, he does the same thing as Withers. He buys all these parcels and he makes his farm bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is where he spends much of his time. He goes for December into the spring. So maybe about 4 or 5 months a year, he goes to Sunny Hill. And Geraldine goes down and visits them, and she goes down for part of the time. But they're not together a lot. And I think this has left an impression. They must not have had a very good marriage. They must not have gotten along. Why is he not home more? Betty Babcock writes in her letters that he would go Canadian geese in the fall, and then to Sunny Hill, and he would go to the Florida Keys, and he would fish. And so every season had a hunting destination for him. Out west for hunting mountain lions. And he really was away a lot, doing his thing, what he enjoyed doing. I kind of disagree. I think I messed up my PowerPoint here because I hit something. She liked hunting too. So here's a picture of Mrs. Thompson. This looks to me like Sunny Hill. I think that she is in Sunny Hill in this picture, especially with the wagon and everything. And interviews with some of the staff that worked here remarked she was as good a hunter as the men. She was really good. And so, that might be part of the reason why Lou really liked her. She was game. She was game to go hunting. She was a good athlete. She was going to go on and do what he did, So I think that was part of it as well. And then there's this. And I found this, I thought, aha. So who's Dr. Henry Loomis? Dr. Henry Loomis was the Thompson's doctor. And so we go back to Colonel Thompson's letters to Camden. He writes to Camden and he goes, oh, Annie's sick, this one's sick, that one's sick, this one has tuberculosis. Should I send them to Dr. Loomis? Dr. Loomis comes up in the letters. Dr. Loomis was probably the foremost lung specialist in New York. And he wrote an article in a handbook published in 1903 by the charity organization of the city of New York called A Handbook on the Prevention of Tuberculosis. Because tuberculosis is the biggest killer, right? We want to prevent it. And so in this part of this book, he writes that there's 3 things that are important for people who've had consumption. Now remember, Lou had one name, okay? 1, sunshine. Colorado Springs, he mentions, good place to be. 2, the Adirondack Mountains. And I'm going to talk to you about the Adirondack Mountains next. I'll go to the Adirondack Mountains in the summer. 3, Thomasville, Georgia. That's the guy. He's like, who talks about Thomasville, Georgia specifically? Those 3 places are the places Dr. Loomis says, if you want to stay healthy with consumption, that's where you go. These are the places that Lou goes. He follows doctor's orders, and he actually lives to be 70 years old in a family where everybody is dying very young. So I think Lou was following doctor's orders, and I don't think that he was trying to get away from Geraldine. That's my opinion from reading it. You want to pursue altitude, dryness, and elevation. And then I found this. Oh, this is the best. So I had been dying for a letter between Lou and Geraldine. I have letters from Lou to other people. I have letters from Geraldine to other people. I wanted to see how they talk to each other, desperately. One day, I just was in the Harvard papers of Miriam Van Moorer's, as is my wont, scrolling through PDFs of letters, and I said, there's a folder here I've never clicked on. One of the folders I've never clicked on is miscellaneous. Always look at miscellaneous, right? So this was a miscellaneous folder that said miscellaneous, parentheses, not Miriam Van Moorer's. I said, I don't think I've ever looked in here. Click. The first thing that popped up is Lou's handwriting. And the letter, I know you can't read it, but that's Lou's letter. It's actually 4 pages long. It's a very long letter. But it starts off, I see the type of the letter and the letterhead, and you can really tell because these people all had really nice printed stationery with their address on it. This one is actually stationery from a fishing boat in Keys. So the people in the archive did not know who these people were or anything. I had no idea. So this is a fishing boat in the Keys called the Twin Screw Charter Houseboat. The Scurry is the name of the boat. And the letter starts off, Dearest Honey. Dearest Honey. And I see it's Lou's handwriting, so quickly I go to the next page. Like, who signed this letter? And so at the end of the letter, he writes, the letter is 3 pages of him chasing a tarpon around the Florida Keys and losing all his line, and it's like Old Man in the Sea before Hemingway wrote it, right? So he is talking about all the stuff that's going on in the fishing boat, and then he gets personal at the end. You are the dearest person in all of this world to me, and I send you all of my love, always your own, Lou. I got it. I got the thing that I had wanted, and I said, see? He wasn't trying to get away from Geraldine. He loves her. And so I think, when you dig into this work, you never know what you're going to find. And it was just really wonderful to find this. And I think that the archive even has the wrong date on it. They have it dated at 1924. I actually think it's 1934. So the Thompsons, 1905, this picture of this carriage I was in it. Thompson kids, Lou's on the back with his foot up on the back of the carriage. It's being driven by Bonnie Kelly, who had worked here for decades. His children and their children all worked here as well. And the children are all piled into that carriage, except that Geraldine's not in this picture. I don't have a picture of Geraldine and 4 kids and Lou. I don't have that yet. That'll be my next talk. You'll see what I find there, right? So this was their family picture. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to read you part of the first chapter that I've written in this book. And the first chapter of this book, I'm kind of going to read it here because the first chapter of this book talks about something that happened in 1903. So the kids she's got 3 kids at this point, we're at 4. She's got 3 children, small children. And the chapter begins not in New Jersey, but in the Adirondacks. So I'm going to get back to the Adirondacks. So every year, they would go to the Adirondacks for a month. They would rent a camp and stay in a little 3-room cabin and sleep outside under a tent on a platform with a tent over it. It was good to sleep outside if you had tuberculosis. It was good for your lungs. And all the kids learned how to swim and hike and canoe there. And so the Adirondacks held this very special charm for them. Lou, not so much. He didn't really love the Adirondacks. He went, but he would kind of come and go. But he did really he was an engineer. He was a trained engineer. He went to MIT. And he liked to tinker with cars, and he liked to tinker with boats. And in the early 1900s, he had built a speedboat using a wooden boat, and he put with it an automobile engine. So he built this really fast speedboat, and he loved to race it. He raced it here in the Navasink. He raced it with the Red Bank Yacht Club. He took it all over the place. He raced his boat all over the place, and it plays a role in the story. The name of the boat is the Flying Fretz, F-R-E-T-Z, and if you look it up in the newspapers, you see there's lots of articles about the Flying Fretz, because Lou raced it all over the place, and he won a lot of awards. He won a lot of races with it. So they pack up their wagon, kids, pets, staff, dishes, hampers, trunks for a month up in the Adirondacks, and it takes them 2 days to get up there. Trains and buckboards and guide boats to get to this remote place in the Adirondacks. And for years, they went to the Adirondacks. Even in the 1940s, there's some pictures of them with the grandchildren in the Adirondacks, Mrs. Thompson laying under a tree reading a book. And so they continued to go for decades to the Adirondacks. So this is early in their marriage, 1903. They've been married for 7 years. They've got 3 children. And something happens. So I'm just going to read you part of chapter 1. Draft, but part of chapter 1. This is called The Pen. So here's where we're going to be. We're going to be in Upper St. Regis Lake in the Adirondacks. Beautiful, wooded, calm lakes. And I love this picture. This is one of the only pictures I have of Lou and Geraldine in the Adirondacks, actually. Probably about this time, about 1900. And before the chapter starts, I have a quote from Betty Babcock from A Triangle of Land. You could absolutely count on her rushing to the rescue and being with you until you were safe again or dead. The Pen. On July 10, 1903, the summer routine was interrupted when a baby's screams filled the cooker can. Geraldine Thompson's 7-month-old baby girl, nicknamed Puss, started to choke while playing on their cabin's floor. The nurse, Mrs. Thompson, came running. When she examined the baby's clothes, she noticed empty pinholes where a small safety pin had once secured the child's waistband. The realization that Puss had swallowed a safety pin sent a burst of maternal adrenaline through Mrs. Thompson's body. As Puss gasped, they tried unsuccessfully to remove the pin by turning the baby upside down, holding her by her heels, and violently shaking her to dislodge the pin. When this failed, Mrs. Thompson panicked and reached her fingers down the child's throat to pull the pin out. She even tried to use a button hook to remove the pin, to no avail. After 15 minutes, it was clear that they had made matters worse. The unclasped pin was now further down Puss's throat. The thought of the sharp point of the pin threading the inside of the baby's soft throat set Geraldine Thompson in motion. She grabbed Puss and ran to the boat dock on the lake. With the child perched on her hip, she started the engine of the Flying Threats and cast off. Her husband's enthusiasm for fast horses, fast cars, and fast boats came in handy that day. As the Flying Threats knifed through the lake, Mrs. Thompson disturbed the serenity of the camps, creating ripples in the serene lake water along the channel. Dressed in a white high-neck linen blouse and a long skirt, Mrs. Thompson sped by the Adirondacks camps. She piloted the Flying Threats through the calm cold water of St. Regis Lake toward the only source of help over 8 miles away. 30 minutes later, the Flying Threats reached Paul Smith's Hotel. Opened in 1859, the hotel was the most well-known summer resort in the Adirondacks. The over 300-room complex was the product of the famous hotelier Paul Smith's personality and business acumen. More important, the guests at the famous resort included 2 renowned tuberculosis physicians, Dr. Edward L. Trudeau and Dr. Walter B. James. Trudeau maintained a sanatorium nearby, so despite the remote location of the resort, it was fortunate that the cold mountain air attracted these men. Trudeau and James were trained at some of the finest hospitals in the country. As recovered consumptives, Geraldine and Louis Thompson visited the region for their health as well as for the vacation. On this day, Trudeau's medical advice was going to draw not on his specialty, the lungs, but on an adjacent body part, the throat. Despite many years of treating patients in the sanatorium in Saranac Lake, the 2 venerable doctors failed to remove the pin. Within minutes of examining Puss, Trudeau and James determined that they did not have the necessary instrument for the procedure. Trudeau explained that the pin had gone down sharp side up and was stuck like a barbed hook where the esophagus narrows at the gullet. During the vigorous struggle to remove it, the point of the pin embedded in the throat, and unless the proper instruments were used, the pin was likely to penetrate the trachea. The good news was that with the correct instruments, the pin could be removed in a matter of minutes. The bad news was that the lakes and mountains of New York State were 400 miles from New York City, and a hospital with the medical instruments needed to remove the pin. Unfortunately, the daily train to New York had already departed from the local station. How could they get to a hospital 400 miles away in time to save the baby from grave danger? Mrs. Thompson decided that her best chance was to charter a special train to New York City. Without a moment's hesitation, she called the train station agent and said, "Get me a special train for New York at once. My baby's life depends on it. Not an instant's delay anywhere." In 1903, a special train was the only option, and an expensive one at that. At a cost of $1,000, Mrs. Thompson arranged the special train to take them to New York City as quickly as possible. Even so, they were facing a several-hour journey from the remote reaches of the Adirondacks to the hospital in the heart of Manhattan. However, 15 minutes after she hung up the phone, they were on board the train bound for New York. When the station agent, engineer, and telegraph operator heard that the special train was ordered to save a baby, they acted to get the train to New York City as quickly as possible. The engineer opened the throttle wide and let the train travel as fast as it would go as they sped past the train depots through the Adirondacks. The railroad through this part of New York ran on a single track as the special train sped past Saranac Inn, Tupper Lake, Chilwell, Fulton Chain, and other stations. Any obstacles were hustled out of the way quickly to allow the special train to arrive in Utica in only 3 hours, nearly 2 hours faster than was normal. The station agents along the train's path sent ahead a message that the train was speeding to save a baby's life. Kindly, Dr. James and Trudeau accompanied them on the train. Telegrams were sent to Lewis Thompson, as well as to the throat specialist, Dr. Joseph E. Winters. Trudeau continued to attend to Puss on the journey with remedies, including cocaine, and made her comfortable with ice to reduce inflammation. As the New York City towns and cities flew past the train windows, the once hysterical child was now growing weak and exhausted. Puss had not been fed because they feared swallowing would move the pin further down her throat. After suffering intense pain for hours, she was limp and blue. Without the strength to cough, her worried mother never took her eyes off the pitiable child. Despite the incredible efforts of the men on the railroad, there were some inevitable delays along the way. When the special train reached Fishkill on the Hudson, a broken-down freight train engine blocked the track, but after it was removed, it was clear sailing the rest of the way. Finally, a few minutes after 11 o'clock at night, the special train pulled into Grand Central Station, and the throat specialist and Lewis Thompson were there to meet them. The party gathered the child and raced in a carriage to West 59th Street and 10th Avenue, the address of Roosevelt Hospital. Dr. Winters had everything ready for the procedure in the operating room, including the special instruments Dr. Trudeau had insisted were necessary that morning. Puss was laid on her back on the examining table, where a nurse administered anesthetic before Dr. Winters explored her throat. His examination revealed that the pin was deeply embedded in the left side of the throat, where the esophagus meets the pharynx. Using a blunt hook, Dr. Winters dislodged the pin and used Fauville's throat forceps on the outside of the neck to prevent the now freed pin from being swallowed. Next, Dawson's flexible forceps, which are long and thin and whose shape matches the contours of the throat, grasped the pin, squeezed the ends of the pin together, and withdrew it. Puss did not suffer any further injury during the procedure, and after the child's mouth and throat were rinsed with antiseptic, she was released from the hospital. The relieved and weary family went to Geraldine Thompson's mother's home on Washington Square, where Puss rested peacefully that night. After a long and harrowing day, it was all over in approximately 5 minutes. The doctor explained that Puss would not have been able to endure the pain for even 1 day longer. Due to the instant removal of the pin had saved her life. The successful outcome was due to excellent railroading, the best doctors, and above all, the tenacity of Geraldine Thompson. For the first time on July 10, 1903, Mrs. Thompson saved the day. Oh, good, guys. That was hard for me. It's the first time I shared that with anybody. So the idea that she kind of comes to the rescue, right? So she, throughout her life, saves the day many times. And one of the times that she saves the day also led to her founding of Monmouth County Organization for Social Services, which I mentioned earlier. In 1912, Mrs. Thompson appeared at a Monmouth County freeholders meeting where she explained to the freeholders that an African-American 12-year-old boy named Arkansas Bass was at that moment laying in Long Branch Hospital, suffering from tuberculosis that had moved from his lungs into his bones, that he was terminal, that one of his arms had been amputated. But his family was poor, and he could not afford to go to the hospital. She explained that if he was returned to his home, he would be spreading tuberculosis to the other members of his family. That this was a public health danger, and it was a humanitarian issue for the dignity of this terminally ill young man. And so in the papers, it reported that she advocated for Arkansas baths and asked that the Monmouth County freeholders pay for his care at a tuberculosis hospital. She had contacted several, and only 2 were willing to take it. And the freeholders said that they would think about it and see if it was legal for them to use county funds for the care that was needed. It was going to cost about $9 a week. And 2 weeks later, this piece appeared in the Daily Record, which is the Long Branch paper, and it says, "Boy incurable taken to hospital." That Arkansas baths, who underwent several operations at the hospital here to prevent the spread of tubercular trouble, was taken to the Trenton Municipal and County Hospital for Tuberculosis. He was admitted through the efforts of Mrs. Lewis S. Thompson. And so she gets the county freeholders to agree to pay for his care. She knew that if she had them pay for Arkansas baths, that she was setting a precedent for a public-private partnership for healthcare. Monmouth County had no public service. They had no services. There were not enough hospital beds for the people that were here. There was not enough care. And so 2 weeks later, in July of 1912, she holds the first meeting of MCOSS, which at that time was the State Charity Aid Association. But she holds the first meeting of MCOSS at Brookdale Forum in July. And it's still in operation today, 110 years later. She also advocated for the building of a tuberculosis hospital where people could go, in Monmouth County residents could go for treatment. There was nowhere for people in Monmouth County to go except for really far away. The freeholders told her, well, we don't know if there's a need and if people really want to pay for this, so get us a petition. So she circulates a petition. 4 years later, she shows up at another freeholders meeting. And I love this article because it says, "A great bundles of paper were laid on the table." So she goes to this freeholders meeting in 1916, 4 years later, and she drops this enormous bundle of paper on the table that had over 12,000 signatures, which was half the voters of Monmouth County, to prove to them that it was needed to have a hospital in the county to serve people. When you're recovering from tuberculosis, you have to rest a really long time. So if you go to a tuberculosis hospital hours and hours away, you can't see your family, you can't get visitors. It's very lonely and depressing and isolating. So she wanted this to take place. 1921, they opened this hospital, which was the Allenwood Tuberculosis Hospital in what is now Farmingdale. So it starts in 1812, and then she's still fighting in 1916, and it's finally built and opened in 1921. And this is really the beginning of her career. And so in 1940, when she was interviewed in the papers, she said, "Nothing is futile. Even if a project gets results once out of every 5 times, or once out of every 10 times, that is something to be thankful for. At least that much has been accomplished." So she never gave up. She never gave up. And she didn't always win. She didn't always get her way. Didn't always lead to success. But she had this persistence and the courage and the persistence to keep fighting for what she believed she was right. The fight for tuberculosis also hit very close to home. Her daughter, Puss, who was the Puss in the earlier story at the pin, in the 1920s, she got married, And she also did the midwifery course at Bellevue Hospital. She became a midwife. And she wanted to do frontier midwifery. So she went to Kentucky and she became a frontier midwife. When she became a frontier midwife, however, she caught tuberculosis. And so from the late 1920s, she suffered relapses and bronchitis and different kinds of lung ailments, some periods of health, but a lot of periods of illness. And I'm including the picture on this slide of the back of the house with Belvedere's, courtesy of Dale Hunton and Monmouth County Park System. That, remember, one of the things that tubercular victims needed sunshine. So she built these big windows in the back of the house for us to be able to live on the third floor and to get the sunlight while she was recovering. She took us everywhere for treatment. She went to Scimeca Lake and Dr. Trudeau's sanitarium up there. She went to New York for operations. She went to Arizona. She went to Colorado. She went all over for this, for her daughter's health. And she had a really hard time sitting still. You have to be like a bed rest for really long periods of time. And I found a letter in the Eleanor Roosevelt papers from Puss that explains a little bit of her frame of mind, and I want to share it with you. So she wrote this letter to Eleanor Roosevelt while she was at Saranac Lake Sanatorium up in the Adirondacks. Dear Mrs. Roosevelt, my nerve endings are raw with fatigue, and I think, therefore, that I have a vague idea of how some of our European brothers feel. I don't mind not surviving, but I'm licked when it comes to this shadow world, and I'm not fit company for man or beast. Should things go well, you'll hear from me often. Should I disappear into thin air, I'll remember how much and how deeply I have loved and respected you, Mr. President. A heart full of love, Puss. Love to my dear aunt, and please don't talk me over with my mom. She had a really fantastic sense of humor, and her letters are hilarious. Her aunt, so she says, love to my dear aunt. Eleanor Roosevelt's secretary was Malvina Thompson. No relation. But she always called her Aunt Malvina because they were both Thompsons, even though they're not related. So she always called her Aunt Malvina. But she suffered terribly. And you really feel her pain in that letter of facing death. Facing death. She died in 1949 at the age of 56. So all these accomplishments Mrs. Thompson has, all these great triumphs in public health, she can't save her own daughter. And it's really a big part of the story of Mrs. Thompson Saves the Day. Another one of her children also faced enormous challenges. Her oldest son, Bill Thompson, Dr. Bill Thompson, when he was a young teenager, I think he was about 15, the family took a trip to Switzerland in 1913. And while they were in Switzerland, Bill decided he was going to go out and climb a glacier by himself. And he never came back. And turns out he fell down the side of the glacier and landed, crushed his leg, and landed on a ledge. They couldn't find him. And the Daily Register reported on this September 10th, 1913, that the rescue party was sent out by his mother, succeeded in finding him the next day. So he was laying out on that ledge in the cold all night. When they found him, his leg was so badly damaged that the European doctor who saw him in the hospital wanted to amputate it. And the family said, no, we're going to go back to the United States. And he underwent dozens of operations and recovered at Brookdale. And he did go back to school. He went to St. Mark's School, as all the boys in the family went to the St. Mark's School, and then he went to Yale. He graduated from Yale and went to medical school, and he became a very well-respected doctor. But he was always disabled. And Laura Harding talks about him in her interview. She says that when she saw Bill, he was using a walker. So Mrs. Thompson, she built the Belvedere's for Puss, and she built the one-story house for Bill, so we wouldn't have to go upstairs. So when I say that Brookdale Farm becomes a character in the story, that it's where people come for to restore, to rest, to recover, but also for fundraisers and meetings and activism, that it becomes the centerpiece of her life and plays this really important role. Miriam. So I'm going to come back to Miriam here. I talked to you a little bit about her diary earlier. And so Miriam writes in her diary, when she came to Brookdale, she called Brookdale for the weekend Brookdale Magic. Because Brookdale Magic meant to her rest and walking in the woods and getting back to nature and recharging her batteries. She was really famous in her own right. She was a famous reformer and a penologist and a really well-celebrated professional. She published many books. She spoke at the United Nations. She was really a famous woman. And she had a 40-year relationship with Mrs. Thompson. And I think she actually met Mrs. Thompson through Puss. Puss had purchased one of Miriam's books for her mother because it was on prison reform. And she writes a letter to Miriam Van Waters in 1927 where she says, "Hey, will you write to my mother? She would really love to hear from you. She's a real fan of yours." And they meet ultimately at a corrections meeting in California. And that began a 40-year relationship. And it's very difficult for historians to decide the nature. What is the nature of this relationship? These women did not call themselves lesbians. To be a lesbian was, at the time, a psychological diagnosis in the DSM. They did not identify as lesbians because of the stigma, and they did not consider themselves part of, they did not come out publicly. And nevertheless, we do have letters, and the letters speak for themselves. They are certainly completely in love with each other, support each other, and have an extremely affectionate correspondence. The fact that Betty Babcock never mentions Miriam in any of her writings is sort of a red flag. Betty was also very close with Miriam. Miriam was a member of her family. She was at every event. She came to Brookdale. She was the godmother to Puss's son. She was a member of their family. But never is she mentioned by Betty Babcock. Betty Babcock wrote to her. Betty Babcock has tons of letters in Miriam's papers, too. So the absence, the deliberate protection of her mother from mentioning Miriam at all. So I'm just going to read this letter. Now, Miriam did destroy most of their letters. She was fired from her position as a superintendent of the Framingham Women's Reformatory, and she was not accused of being a lesbian, but she was accused of being permissive of lesbian behavior at the prison. So they didn't come out and accuse her, but they sort of did. And so during that period where she was under attack, she burned a lot of letters. And there's a whole article written about this. So I'm not going to go into that, but I am going to read you one of the letters. I actually wrote two, because I'm a glutton and I can't decide. So here's one letter. This is one letter from 1929 from Geraldine Thompson to Miriam Van Waters that survives and is in the Miriam Van Waters papers. Miriam, dearest, my love to you and every best blessing. I hope Christmas will give you a sort of rest and comfort and a respite. I have a heartache in coming home here without you. I looked into your room hoping some miracle would let me find you sitting at the table near the window. You see, miracles do happen, have happened, and will happen again. And just tonight, I wanted the heavens to open. Good night, my dear, my dearest, yours, Geraldine. And so, historians, this has sort of really been a great thing for Geraldine Thompson to have these letters discovered, because it has really brought her back into the historical conversation. The historians are looking at these and are wondering on what to do and how do we categorize. This woman had a marriage, 4 children to Hugh Thompson for 40 years until his death in 1936. And then she meets Miriam Van Waters in about 1927, and they sort of get really close in about 1930 and until the 1960s, close to when Mrs. Thompson passes away. Their relationship lasts all that time. So I think we should be happy for Geraldine that she had this much love in her life, that she had these 2 people that she loved so dearly and gave her so much in her life. She was also a really great friend to Miriam. She helped Miriam with her career. She provided money for her projects. She was an enormous support. So it's a really beautiful and supportive relationship for us to look at. Here's another one of her notes that she sent. She sends Miriam a little red teapot for her tea table at the framing in Sherborne at her house. And she explains, this little red teapot, it should give you warmth and comfort. I wish I was there with you at the tea table. And it's really a beautiful little note. The other part of Mrs. Thompson's life is the politics. And she was a political force. It's really amazing to me how much the man, because politics is so male-dominated, how she was able to stand in there with the men and get things done, even in this male-dominated world of politics. And I found this article in Asbury Park Press from January 29th, 1920 that I thought was really, really cool. So January 29th, 1920, women don't have the right to vote yet, and suffrage had been a really hot issue. And the article's title is GOP Machine Picks Big Four for Convention. So the GOP in the end of January, the Republicans met in Atlantic City to decide who's going to get the ballot names, who are we going to put for governor, senator, all of that, who are we going to pick? So this is sort of just as primaries are coming in, but there's still sort of backroom deals going on in smoky back rooms. Who are we going to let be our candidate? But who's there? Mrs. Thompson's there. And I was absolutely amazed that towards the end of the article, it says, Mrs. Thompson sits in. And I could just imagine her with these, who's at this meeting is Nucky Johnson. Do you guys watch Boardwalk Empire? Nucky Johnson is there. Like these real characters and political bosses in this machine politics. And Mrs. Thompson sitting there. And says Mrs. Thompson sits in. One woman was present at the conference. Mrs. Lewis L. Thompson of Red Bank sat in while the conference were discussing the plans of finance. She was the vice chairman of the Republican National Committee, and she was in charge of the money. And so she was going to have a say in who got what line. And I just think it's a really interesting part of her story, how she is able to use her wealth and able to use her influence in politics to protect her interests in public health and in the agencies, but also stand in there with these rough characters and still be the only woman in the room. That had to be really hard, but really, really interesting part of the story. She was a staunch Republican. She was the delegate, as I mentioned before, to the RNC from 1924 to 1952. She was a real fan of Eisenhower. And she was the president of the New Jersey Women's Republican Committee, a Monmouth County committee woman, and after suffrage in 1920, 4 out of 5 women joined the Republican Party in New Jersey. So it was by far the most women joined the Republican Party. So I'm just going to finish the press. Should I go to Eleanor or should I go to the farm? So Eleanor is a good friend of hers. They help each other throughout the 30s and the 40s, constantly attending each other's events and helping each other. There's Eleanor at Brookdale Farm. And so let me just talk about what happens to the farm. So I've been working, believe it or not, I had kind of worked out the first chapter and the last chapter. It's the ones in the middle that are still kind of fluid. But the last chapter is going to be called An Unwelcome Gift. I called it an unwelcome gift because in Betty Babcock's letter, one of Betty Babcock's letters, she talks about what was going to happen to the farm when her mom passed away. And Puss and Bill had both died in the 1940s. So the only 2 remaining Thompson children was Louis Thompson Jr., who they called Pinky, and Betty. And Mrs. Thompson wanted desperately for a Thompson to live on the farm, to inherit it, to carry on the Thompson name at the farm. I know, we understand that, right? She had this real connection to this land, and she really, really wanted it to go to one of the Thompsons. Betty, of course, had been living in Long Island for many years. She was not coming back. None of her grandchildren were really going to do it. And so she really kind of backs her son, Louis Jr., into a corner. And she wants him to take the farm. He had retired from the Air Force. He was the assistant secretary to the Air Force under Eisenhower's administration, and he retired. He was very sick. He had cancer. He had a cancer operation, but returned to work, didn't get better, and retired. And he retired with his wife from Washington, D.C. They left Washington, and they moved to Georgia, to his wife's family's plantation there. But Mrs. Thompson doesn't give up, right? We know this about her. And so she's going to try to back her son into taking the farm. You know, when somebody wants you to do something, right? Figure out how to get them to do it. So what she decided to do was she decided to give him part of the farm. And she takes part of the farm, 200 acres over here where Brookdale is, which was called the church farm, and she gives it to him. She says, oh, it'll be good for you. It'll be a tax write-off. It'll be good, for tax purposes. She's just trying to manipulate him, right? She wants him to have part of it. And kind of brought to mind, her personality, right? She ruled the family. She ruled everything she did. In her will, she also made provision to give part of the land to her grandson, Peter Van Gerbig, who was Puss's son, who had really grown up on the farm. But she makes all these conditions that he can have the land if he lives here. She'll give him money to build a house if he lives here. So she's trying to push, using her will and using what she can to force somebody to do what she wants, which is to live here on the farm. And it brought to mind a quote from her that was published in an article in a newspaper in 1951, and she told the reporter, I push and prod and get a certain amount done. I know I open doors. If I can't open them in one place, I try another. So she tried this. And then she tried Peter. And so she's trying to figure out who she's going to get to do what she wants. And then there's the pump system. So as she was getting older, she was really preoccupied with what was going to happen to the farm. And there are several different organizations who contacted her. Rutgers wanted it. The Quaker Church wanted it. So she's getting these offers, and it's really well described in the Zink book on the history of the Monmouth County Park System. But ultimately, she works out a deal with the Monmouth County freeholders to donate 215 acres of the farm to the Monmouth County Park System for park land only. So she has a lot of, she's very clear about her wishes. She wants it to be a playground. She wants it to be for children. She wants it to be for birds. And so ultimately, what she ends up doing is donating her land to make really the centerpiece of the Monmouth County Park System. Because in the 50s, the population was booming. There was not enough park space. And by donating her land to make the park, this is the Asbury Park Press article, she actually led the way again. And she led the way other women who had large parcels of land and farms followed her lead, and Hartshorn Woods and Uberwoods and these other women also donated their farms upon their deaths as well. And so when I think about this unwelcome gift, that nobody in the family ends up living here. So she doesn't win that battle. But I would think that if she knew that this college was here, providing education to the people of Monmouth County so that they could have careers and have lives. If she knew the amount of people who jog and walk and bike to Town Park every day, I would have to think that she would be extremely pleased that her land was not left to a member of the Thompson family, but it was really left to all of us as her family. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions?